He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. Later in this week's programme, AI and the BBC. The top boss at the BBC said this week that the UK's future is at risk from social media platforms and disinformation. He also said the public broadcaster could reverse this and be a unifier in the online AI age, not just in the UK but worldwide. And as part of this, Tim Davie said that cutting-edge AI technology will be blended with BBC journalism to create a healthy core of fact-based news. This week I talk with the BBC boss who's tasked with looking into the future of technology and news, and she tells us how the BBC already puts AI into news and documentaries, sometimes in ways you might not expect.
The anonymity that you grant people sometimes in a TV programme. There are much better ways of doing a face swap, a deep fake face swap, and we do that.
That's the BBC's Laura Ellis coming up soon. But before that, Mediawatch takes a look at the coverage of the political outcry that was sparked by the sudden change to legislation for pay equity claims and by one rude word in one newspaper column that shifted the debate this week.
Mikey, this pay equity issue isn't going away, is it?
Well, certainly it's not. It's been a week since the government rammed through pay equity legislation under urgency through Parliament, and yet it's still all anyone can talk about.
That was Simon Dallow on TVNZ's One News at 6 last Tuesday with the political editor Mikey Sherman live in the dark outside Parliament. And 7 days earlier, journalists and the public, and even most MPs, were all in the dark about the pay equity claim legislation that was about to be passed under urgency, with no select committee scrutiny or regulatory impact statements or any forewarnings for anyone else. On 3 News at the same time, Lloyd Burr reckoned the story would run and run.
And resiliency is something the government will need, with the pay equity debate showing no signs of abating.
And back on One News, Mikey Sherman also reckoned it had plenty of legs left in it too.
Clearly, pay equity is still dominating the conversation, and we're expecting that to continue all the way up until budget day next week.
And all the while, the opposition accused the government of hiding the truth about this, and the government accused the opposition of lying. Hayden Donnell now looks at how the media sorted the facts from the friction.
Thanks, Colin. This pay equity issue isn't going away, is it? Don't answer that. This is my turn. It's not. And that could be partly because the media has put it at the top of almost every homepage, front page and news bulletin for the better part of 2 weeks. A lot of that coverage, particularly in the early going, was negative to downright angry. At Newsroom, Dame Anne Salmond said she was incandescent with rage over National's move to halt 33 existing pay equity claims and make them start again under a new, more stringent scheme. In an opinion column for The Post, Stuff's National Affairs editor Andrea Vance accused 6 senior female MPs of acting like a word beginning with C that's still number 2 on the BSA's list of most offensive terms and probably not appropriate to say to people tuning into RNZ National at 9 a.m. on a Sunday. More on that later. Disability support worker Jo Chanel Pofidi was equally to the point on One News.
What's your message to the women in government, particularly the ministers?
They can kiss my fat ass.
The epithets kept coming on the podcast 3 Girls, 1 Beehive, where presenter Esther Robinson introduced a discussion on the legislation like this.
Kate Shepherd will be turning over in her grave over this, I think, ladies.
The living weren't too hot on the government's move either. Robinson's co-host Georgina Stilianou was also giving it grief.
I just think it's just sheer stupidity, taking the moral and all the stuff that you said, Esther, around the actual fairness and what this actually means for people, taking all that out of it and just thinking politically, what the
Yeah.
Maybe the political handling was a bit because the government wasn't quite anticipating such an intense barrage of bad press over its move. It took a few days to come up with some messaging in response, but once it did, it really hammered it hard. Here's Prime Minister Christopher Luxon under questioning in Parliament.
All that we have done is fix the labour law that was unworkable and also unaffordable, and that compared librarians to fisheries officers.
Here's Senior Cabinet Minister Chris Bishop.
The problem is Labor designed a pay equity regime that was so loose and unworkable, it resulted in social workers being compared with detectives, librarians with fisheries officers.
Here's Social Development Minister Louise Upston in an Instagram video recorded in a car.
For example, female admin workers were being considered with male mechanical engineers, or female librarians with male fisheries officers.
The ACT Party was even more concise, just posting a picture of a female librarian and a male fisheries officer next to each other with an equal sign in between them to X, along with the words, "This is what pay equity looks like under Labour." That sparked a round of fact-checking, including from, full disclosure, one Hayden Donnell over at the Spin-Off. At the conversation, 3 Waikato University lecturers teamed up to explain why comparisons between quite different sectors were a feature, rather than a bug, of the former pay equity legislation.
Pay equity seeks to make visible and fix the deep structural inequalities that have historically seen women's work undervalued compared to men's work. It's about ensuring jobs that are different but of equal value are paid similarly as a way to achieve gender equality.
On RNZ Nights, lawyer Fiona McMillan said finding jobs of different but equal value in male-dominated fields sometimes meant comparing roles that are dissimilar at first glance, like, for instance, fisheries officers and librarians.
It actually helps everyone if you find a comparator close to home, right?
Yeah.
Parties weren't looking for odd comparators for the fun of it. But often comparators weren't close to home because either one, they didn't exist, or two, those close to home were female dominated anyway.
Yeah.
So it wasn't of assistance.
But these explanations barely had time to clear the political windshield before more mudslinging messed it up again. For a while, journalists were distracted by a lengthy argument between National and Labour over who was lying about what. At 3 News, Lloyd Burr's editor did a great job of making dueling accusations delivered at separate times in different places into a coherent conversation.
They've been lying to New Zealanders all along.
Labor's resorting to lies and misinformation, frankly.
Both sides accusing the other of lying over whether women's pay is being cut.
Taking money away that women were otherwise going to get is a cut.
We're not cutting women's pay.
They are cutting women's pay. They are taking billions of dollars that women were going to receive and they're cutting it. That's cutting women's pay.
We are not cutting equal pay.
Give that person an Oscar for best editing. Burr followed up with an explainer which went through the political back and forth before rightly noting all this debate about semantics risked taking the story away from its central facts.
The truth of that is this. Women who were in the process of a pay equity claim with the government will get a pay rise under the new system, but it won't be as much and it will take much longer to get.
Despite all of this, the plight of those women remained stubbornly in the headlines until Wednesday afternoon, when ACT's Brooke Van Velden stood up in Parliament and said this.
And I do not agree with the clearly gendered and patronising language that Andrea Vance used to reduce senior cabinet ministers to girl bosses, hype squads, references to girl math and
In politics, there's something called a dead cat strategy. If you're in trouble, the wisdom goes, just throw a dead cat on the table. Pretty soon, everyone will have forgotten the original topic and started discussing the dead cat. In this case, cat could be replaced with another slightly less savoury word, also beginning with C. At the very least, we know Van Velden's historic entry into Hansard was pre-planned. It came as a response to a notified written question from Labour's Jan Tinetti, which referenced a section of Andrea Vance's scathing article for The Post. On Morning Report, RNZ's political editor Joe Moyer confirmed the ACT MP had done some groundwork before making her response.
It was a really bizarre decision by Labour yesterday to use that, thinking that it would be some sort of ammunition in the House, and to put it on notice, which meant that Brooke Van Velden had more than a couple of hours to think about how she was going to respond to it as well. Meant that she had time, for example, to go to the Clerk of the House and check whether she could use the C word in the House, which she was told she could, wasn't considered unparliamentary, so she was able to do that. And she was able to really think about how to kind of claw that narrative back.
If this was all a distraction tactic from the government, it worked impeccably. Every single major news website in the country led with Van Velden's C-bomb detonation. It was the lead story on One News. 3 News delivered this bulletin opening play on words.
To see or not to see? That was the question for Parliament when Workplace Relations Minister Brooke Van Velden chose to use the C word in full today during a fiery debate in the House.
The following morning, TVNZ's Breakfast brought in a language expert to discuss the nuances of calling someone a beep.
You know, the more we use it, does that take away the sting of the word?
Absolutely.
Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So we call that semantic bleaching.
That interview was really interesting, but as Moya noted on RNZ, it was also a sign that the coverage had strayed quite a long way from the original topic, which, if you need a reminder, was pay equity for low-paid women.
Everyone stopped talking about the issues that Labor had been on this and instead are talking about, what language is appropriate or inappropriate and whether a former Minister for Women was wrong to be raising remarks from a column that, many people do believe were misogynistic.
Or as Labour MP Kieran McAnulty put it while sitting shoulder to shoulder with Chris Bishop on TVNZ's Breakfast,
billions of dollars that was earmarked for future settlements that would have gone to women workers isn't going to now. And that is the issue that we really want to focus on. You're right, there's been a few distractions and attempts to try and point the finger elsewhere and, hey, look over here. But at the end of the day, those things remain, and we will keep talking about it because it matters a lot to many, many New Zealanders.
Quite right, though it might have helped if Labour's own MP and former Minister for Women hadn't brought the column up in a written parliamentary question. Overall, the week has been a lesson in both how forceful and single-minded our media can be sometimes and how easy it is to divert. There's no easy solution. When someone dumps a dead C on the table in Parliament, it's hard not to talk about it. But though it pains me personally and professionally to admit it, a debate about media ethics is probably not the most important thing at play in this story. That would be, instead, the thousands of low-paid women who won't be getting a pay rise that they were counting on, at least in the near future. Hopefully, even as new, potentially sweary developments arrive, their story doesn't go away.
Hayden Donnell there, looking back at how our media managed the fractious political debate this week about pay equity laws and got sidetracked by that C-bomb in the Sunday Star Times. Well, as we heard from Hayden there, the debate about pay equity was partly derailed by one word which had never been heard out loud before in our parliament. Now it's part of the parliamentary record and political history. But that C word is not entirely unheard in our media. Edgy movies and dramas on TV, indeed, might have quite a few of them in their script, especially if they're on pay TV. But you would need a green light from the top before any news organisation here would deem a word like that as fit to print or broadcast. In fact, words that bad are only ever used in specific contexts and usually with a bit of warning. But a senior journalist choosing that word, albeit in a censored form, to aim at senior politicians in writing, well, that really is a first. This week, requests for interviews about the thinking behind that were rebuffed by Stuff. Instead, it issued a simple statement which said, "The use of controversial language is carefully reviewed by experienced editors, and on this occasion it was decided it was acceptable in this context." Now, the last time that Stuff published the C word was in 2022, when the editor of the Post at that time actually explained to the readers why they'd done it on the front page. Anna Fifield said that the paper quoted in full abuse that was emailed to the Mayor of Porirua so that readers could appreciate the same unpleasant experience that she had when she was ambushed by that language in her inbox. But interestingly, when the offending word first appeared in Andrea Vance's highly critical column in the Sunday Star Times last weekend, it didn't make headlines at that time. Now, it was noted by some on social media that day, including one of the targets, Judith Collins, who called it an appalling personal attack. But at Monday's post-cabinet media conference, the Parliamentary Press Gallery were much more interested in the resignation of Police Deputy Commissioner Jevon McSkimming. Now, the Prime Minister did have this to say, though.
I saw a senior media journalist talk about the C word and associate that with a minister. That is utterly unacceptable to me. We in this place often talk about, and I'm often asked questions about gendered abuse and what's going on in Parliament for our female MPs. And yet we have that conversation. The same people that raise those issues ultimately end up continuing to prosecute the gendered abuse that we're seeing.
But after that, the Parliamentary Press Gallery simply moved on to the National Party's proposed social media ban and other stuff. It was only after the Workplace Minister Brooke Van Velden aired the foul language in full in the House on Wednesday that 4-day-old insult in the Sunday Star Times finally blew up into the news. Now, the next morning, TVNZ's breakfast co-hosts struggled a little with what not to say at 6 a.m. on a Thursday.
This morning I never thought I'd be having this conversation or doing an interview on the C word, but there you go.
Me trying to navigate the landmines of today's show and talking about that. Let us know.
And it was the same for the expert linguist they'd lined up, Andrea Kalude, who spoke of B words and W words, leaving early risers wondering. Now, she said that in the past, the C word was mostly used by men to other men, but most offence was caused by men directing the word to women. But that wasn't the case here, though, as law lecturer Cassandra Mudgway, who has researched online harassment of women in public life, pointed out on Morning Report.
And it doesn't begin or end with a single article and a use of a word. It's been escalating for years. And so I think focusing in on one columnist really distracts from that broader sort of issue of online spaces becoming increasingly hostile for women in public life.
And that is something that Stuff's Andrea Vance has experienced herself, many other female journalists too. Indeed, just 1 month ago, in the same space in the Sunday Star Times, Andrea Vance said there's no doubt that harassment threatens the equal participation of women. But she also added,
I'm desensitised to the point of being bored by MPs complaining about ugly behaviour online.
Now, her point there was that it's all been going on for more than 20 years without a meaningful political response. And she went further in the Sunday Star Times a month ago about politicians. They're complicit, she said. They choose to use social media to boost their own profile or stir up controversy and sentiment. And she noted that Internal Affairs Minister Brooke Van Velden had scrapped the proposals to establish standards for online content and penalties for breaches. Now, that happened a year ago, and the Internal Affairs Minister, incidentally, overseeing those for the former government was Jan Tinetti. Now, some of the points made by Andrea Vance a month ago were also made in the Sunday Star Times by editor Tracy Watkins last weekend, in the same edition of the paper that carried Andrea Vance's controversial column. And Watkins was responding to the government's sudden interest in banning social media for teenagers. But recognising that Nicola Willis had been singled out by Andrea Vance, Nicola Willis got the right of reply from Stuff last weekend, and her rebuttal, headlined "Enough with the slurs, now for some facts on pay equity," went straight to the top of the most read list on stuff.co.nz. Now, it might be some time before we see the C word in print again on a political matter, so maybe all this was just a short-lived lowering of the tone and not business as usual for mainstream media. But New Zealand First Winston Peters made more fresh headlines when he said it was a symptom of something more serious. Seeds of anarchy, he called it, lumping the language in the Sunday Star Times in with recent unruliness in Parliament and accelerating what he called the degradation of democracy. And ironically, his headline-making claim was let loose on X, arguably the most anarchic and democracy-degrading online platform on the internet. Now, predictably perhaps, Winston Peters also blamed the media for some of the bad behaviour in Parliament. They should be reporting it more to the public, he reckoned, though, as we've seen this week, coverage of bad language in Parliament overshadowed, at least for a while, the really important issue that sparked it in the first place. And earlier that same day, News Talk ZB morning host Kerry Woodham told her listeners slipping parliamentary standards are a reflection of us.
You know, I first heard about the death threats against Jacinda Ardern. I thought, well, who hasn't had them? You know, that is not normal. That's not a normal response. The days of Socratic discourse are long gone. So does that mean we have to give up, that we have no expectations of our MPs? No.
Well, that seems reasonable. Online trolls shouldn't set the bar. But Kerry Woodham had another point to make about who should.
We should have differing opinions. But before I'm going to ask anything of our MPs, before I ask anything of my fellow journalists, I'll have a look in the mirror and check myself out.
Good thought, but if she looks in the ZB archives, she'll find plenty of her own condemnations of other New Zealanders as ferals, and that time that she called cyclists entitled rats in lycra, and gits, tits and hooers, as well as freeloaders and rich snobby hypocrites, though she didn't use a top-ranked slur like the Sunday Star Times did last weekend. Now, that was 4 years ago, and since then, 3 other national News Talk ZB hosts have breached the broadcasting standard for discrimination and denigration, for which there's a really high bar, and arguably that's more offensive than a sexist slur to those on the receiving end. But in the end, even those whose anger about pay equity claims was channelled in that controversial Sunday Star Times piece last weekend probably didn't approve of where it's all ended up. If you watch the commercial TV channels, you've probably come across this ad, which is mocked up like a kind of TV news breaking story.
Breaking news. Skinny Mobile has found a new way to keep prices low. They've digitally cloned their happiest customer to make really cost-effective ads.
Now, in this case, the cheaply made animation of a real person fits the no-frills, low-budget brand of the telco in question, and for that reason they're trumpeting their cost-cutting use of AI and not trying to hide it. However, in news and journalism, people don't yet understand or trust news that's been made by machines, and media companies are now making more use of AI, and it's not all bad. For instance, on some websites, the AI-driven option to listen to this article means a halting, weirdly inflected North American voice will parrot the text back to you out loud, usually with quite a few errors. But on the Herald's website these days, the listen option gives you this.
News publisher Stuff has defended one of its top journalists directing the C word in a published column at Finance Minister Nicola Willis and other female coalition government ministers.
Well, that was part of the Herald's Media Insider article published last Tuesday, all of which can now be read back to you over about 8 minutes from the webpage or the app by the synthesised voice of journalist and presenter Susie Nordquist, powered by AI. Now, it's not quite as good as Susie reading it out live or recorded, but it's not far off. And unlike most of the AI off-the-shelf audio tools that are used for this, that one can do te reo Māori, terms and pronunciation. In the UK this week, the big boss at the BBC warned that the future of Britain was at risk from social media and disinformation, and Tim Davies said cutting-edge AI technology will be blended with the BBC's journalism to power up both. Now, one of those already figuring out what AI technology can and will do in the media, after many years of working in BBC News herself, is Laura Ellis. She's now the head of technology forecasting for the BBC, and she was here in New Zealand this week for the Auckland University of Technology's Technology in Society series. Now, we'll hear more from Laura and others about the potential and pitfalls of AI in the media next week here on Mediawatch. But this week, I asked Laura, how does the BBC already use AI for news and factual programs? Does it make a difference to you that you've come out of a really hard long news background, and now that you're looking at applications of AI for BBC, that news background, does that really become important and colour how you see things?
It's equipped me to react quickly to things. So, when you're in a news environment and you've got a deadline and you've got to do something the next hour or the next minute, tech's moving so fast these days that having the ability to react quickly is a really big superpower. I'm familiar with the idea of doing something which might not be perfect, but which is going to do the job in the time available. And I think, we've had to become much more responsive in technology as a result of the speed of change that we're seeing at the moment. They're new capabilities, but we need to make sure that we dovetail them properly with the old capabilities, which served us really well and still do.
In your role of looking at AI and said, OK, here at the BBC, we should be using that tool, that tool, this one, not sure of the ethics of it, maybe not that one. Are you setting rules for journalists and for program makers?
So people who work in our AI research team in R&D are looking at tools, assessing, how we might use them. And then we have a responsible AI team that are looking at the ethics around them. And also we have obviously a team of lawyers and data specialists who are looking at the terms and conditions to make sure we don't find ourselves in a tool where we're giving away, our content and not be able to keep control of it. And that we're using, the right tools for the right things, that we are assessing them very carefully before we get stuck in. Part of the trick of all this is that you have to accept that you're not going to know stuff and you're going to have to learn on the job and you're going to have to learn really fast. Doing, 11 Labs, really interesting kind of, audio, text to audio tool. It's a very different approach to using technology for journalism, for program making than we've had in the past.
If we take one example, text to video, we've seen these applications and people are, because of the novelty, they're climbing on, they're making video. They look mostly awful when you look at them and not very convincing, six-fingered people, things like that. Is there at the BBC a rule, like, can a journalist, if they want to, make a text-to-video thing to put in an explainer package or something like that? Or is there a red line, is there a policy, is no, this technology is too rough, don't use it? Or are they encouraged to experiment?
So there is a strict rule that we don't use technology like generative AI. We don't use it without talking to the audiences about it. So there's a transparency imperative. So we would never put something out and just go, well, that's a video. And there'd have to be a really good reason for it.
So you do declare it to the audience if
we
it's used?
absolutely declare it. And the sort of thing we might use it for, so here's a really good example. The anonymity that you grant people sometimes in a TV programme when you put a big block over their face or a blob or, pixelate their face. There are much better ways of doing a face swap, a deep fake face swap. And we do that in one of the most recent examples that we
So instead of
used.
pixelating, you put someone else's face on, so it looks a bit better for the audience.
It does, because you can see them actually respond and actually.
And you tell the audience, we have disguised that.
We do.
Wow, okay.
We do. And one of the most recent examples that we used this on was an Alcoholics Anonymous programme. So people wanted to be anonymous, but they also wanted to have their stories told. And we put it in the script as well as putting something on screen. One of the interviewees actually said, my face doesn't matter, what I look like doesn't matter, but what matters is, the story that I'm telling you. So we were very, very clear. Having that transparency, it may not be something that, organisations do forever, because I think we'll gradually get more used to it.
So at the moment, does an editorial boss have to sign off on that at a certain level?
Yeah.
But maybe in 5 years' time, a journalist could just do it?
I mean, I think we will probably see some of the things that we do now as being a bit archaic, like most things, as you kind of reading the news in a dinner jacket, which is what we used to do in the BBC, doesn't happen much anymore. But now the whole trust imperative means that we do really need to be really careful about how we declare stuff. We have a weather product that we have where you have your weather voiced for your area. Now there are 3,000 areas, so you couldn't possibly human voice that. So it's done by a synthetic voice. And we've written blogs about it. It's really hard to declare synthetic media and audio, isn't it? Because, do you at the start of every single weather update say, this is a synthetic voice giving you the weather for this postcode? I mean, it would be really tedious. There's a kind of what we call an indirect and a direct transparency. And the indirect might be that you put something on the app that says, these are synthetic voices, and this is what we do. And it might, but, there is still an imperative to make sure that we give people every chance of understanding what it is that we're doing.
Yeah, it emerged that one of our major newspapers, the New Zealand Herald, headquartered here in Auckland, where I'm speaking to, they were using AI to generate some of their editorials for a weekend paper without declaring that to the audience. Their policy was, look, we'll use AI, we use new products, we innovate. There'll always be a human in the loop. Trust us, was basically the policy. Basically, a lot of companies will get to that point where the audience will probably understand that they're likely to be using these products and won't be told every time?
I think that's probably, where we're likely to be heading. But, if you're using it to, say, generate some news headlines, I'm sitting in an office and I'm writing a news piece, and the headlines are often quite difficult to write because they have to be a certain number of characters. It can be very quick to have AI generate you kind of 10 headlines and you choose one. So very much human in the loop, very much, human oversight of the whole thing. But it's saving a bit of time. But I think when it's something like, let's say you were generating an entire blog series or, podcast, then, I think we would be very clear that we'd need to demonstrate that transparency in quite an upfront way. There is real value in this for audiences. So let's take a piece of content like sport. We do some great football commentaries on quite, low league teams, but teams that you might not see very much written about. And they know the teams like they just know them intimately. They will do these commentaries, and we've never had a written version of them. But now you can use this sort of multimodality to take those commentaries and create short form updates out of them. And that's a really brilliant thing to be able to do because it's value added. No, we would never have the journalistic capacity to do that on a Saturday for kind of however many teams. But by training a model that can take those bits of sport commentary and make them into short form updates, you're adding value, you're giving extra value from a piece of content. We know that a lot of people really enjoy seeing sports stuff in text because they might be doing other things with their lives. They might be out shopping on a Saturday or taking the kids to ballet or whatever, and they can consume this kind of much more, at their will rather than
catch up with it later.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you spoke about AI, for example, in the medical field, being able to see combinations from available data of treatments and medicine that a human researcher just might not spot, and this is happening. Then a sort of media similar application of that was saying, for example, BBC Natural History footage, which are decades of stuff in the vaults in various formats. AI-inspired technology can locate certain animals within that footage that researcher with a trained eye might miss. Is that what's happening?
It was getting a machine trained that could look at, we have something called Spring Watch, Autumn Watch and Winter Watch. not sure why there's not a summer watch. But the 3 watches, we were able to, so what we have is cameras on a lot of nests. So you're seeing birds hatching, you're seeing, other creatures doing their thing. And there's absolutely hours, as you might imagine. If you've got, say, 25 cameras, you've got some poor researcher having to go, right, I'm just going to scroll through hours and hours of this nest not doing very much. Oh, hang on a minute, something's, occurring here that we need to look at. So what we did with the AI was we trained it so it could identify specific animals and could tell you that there was something going on that was newsworthy or, attention-worthy. Because it can painstakingly go through footage, it was able to observe that in one instance there were 2 particular ducks that were entering a burrow at different times, and there was some animal behaviour that we were able to then come to some conclusions on, which we might not have done had we not had a machine eye across that was able to be very meticulous in the way it recorded, duck 1 doing this, duck 2 doing that, and distinguishing between them. So it was a really good use of technology to help you produce a programme and come up with a really good bit of entertaining human outcome. What it also did was, because if you imagine you leave these cameras unattended, you have extraneous noise. That might be somebody walking past and swearing, or it might be somebody starting a car, and it could identify those moments. So again, they didn't pop up unbidden on screen.
And there had actually been controversy about David Attenborough documentary, isn't there? The manipulation of footage of birds in flight or something. I don't know whether it was specifically AI, but these sorts of things can get noticed, can't they? The application of technology, and will be inquired about and possibly pumped up by other media who want to ask questions about
yeah. I think what AI does is it gives us another set of challenges. So let's say you could use AI in a natural history programme to absolutely beautifully alter an image so that you could see mountains in the background and insects in the foreground, which you couldn't do with a normal camera. How do we declare that? It's a really interesting question, isn't it? You don't want something flashing up on the screen saying, this is an AI.
That's a watermark from left to right. Exactly. We monkeyed around with this. Yeah.
You don't want that, but no. We want to be expressive in the things that we publish, around these programs that allows the audience a chance to. We've got magazines and things that we publish that allows the public to understand that this is what is happening.
And it was put to you today that it's kind of bad timing for this technology, for news journalism and trust in media, for technology like this that can amp misinformation or even make it more jazzy. But you also spoke about, for example, provenance of news and show people this is where the origin of the story came from. You can prove that it was either good or bad.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of imposter content, as it's called at the moment. So content that purports to be from the BBC but isn't. We saw a lot of it, particularly around the India-Pakistan conflict recently. If you put provenance signals into your content, you can distinguish it from the content that isn't from yourself as a bona fide broadcaster. Now, what it does require is a bit of technology. It's called cryptographic hashing, and then you also have to have some certification. But those things are quite easy to deliver, and their existing technologies are just using them in a slightly different way, using a standard called C2PA, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. It also requires media literacy on the behalf of the public. So, I hate the fact that we're expecting people to have to do due diligence on the journalism they're consuming, but we do.
But does mean that if a story pops up and says, well, that's interesting, but hang on, people online are saying, this has got to be fake news generated by some sort of... And being able to say that this story that's circulated came from these bot farms and... don't trust it, and hopefully that message gets out too. AI can help with that.
So AI can help with that. So AI, whilst it does, completely kind of scale up disinformation, it also allows you to have some more tools in your armoury to detect where stuff has come from. And I think one of the most important things in mis and disinformation is intent. So why is this story being given to me? Why are they telling me about this? That's one thing. And then if we can take our own content and give it, if you like, a little safety seal and put it out there, giving people the chance to say, okay, I know this is from the BBC. Nobody's saying you have to, but if I've chosen to trust the BBC, then yes, I'll read this piece of content and know that it's come from them.
And the software that enabled the Korean news anchor to keep broadcasting as a deep fake while she was away on holiday, that's probably a no-no.
I don't think I'd want somebody to deepfake me while I was on holiday. If you agree that's something you're happy with and you want to remain on television while you're perhaps, otherwise engaged, it's an option. It's an option for you. So there you go.
I don't think we get away with it at RNZ. Thanks so much, Laura.
Thank you.
That was Laura Ellis, the BBC's Head of Technology Forecasting, here in New Zealand this week for the AUT's Technology in Society series of events. And that's at the AUT, which is currently setting up an AI accelerator hub to get ahead of some of the fast-moving developments in AI. Now, Laura Ellis also said not everything the BBC has done with AI has worked out well, such as third parties putting out their content and making a mess of it.
It's no secret that, lots of us have suffered kind of, detriment, if you like, from that sort of thing happening. So headlines being pulled together that are not correct. And you know how galling that is as a news organisation. It really kind of cuts to the quick because we value so much the accuracy of what we produce. So if it's put out there looking like it's from us and it's not accurate, it hurts us, right? And it really does in so many ways.
And worldwide, media companies are on their guard about big AI firms exploiting what they do.
The sort of rise of AI, journalism companies are trying to be this time more alert and awake, and trying to make deals whereby they get actually some kind of payment for their intellectual property being scraped and taken. But ultimately, Silicon Valley will always win in this because they have the massive money and they have the massive numbers, and they're just going to steamroller. And that is unfortunately the situation we're in.
Though some experts say AI will help revive news.
And trust and confidence in news and information and current affairs. I think that's kind of fractured with the internet and the fragmentation of audiences and the fragmentation of narratives. And I think AI might give us an opportunity to kind of rebuild that.
Next week on Mediawatch, more on those competing visions. And we also talk to a local pioneer of journalism and technology who's also working on a homegrown AI development for the local news scene here. That's it for this weekend. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again next week. And if you have any thoughts for us or ideas for us to follow up, do get in touch. Email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz. And you'll also find us at MediawatchNZ on X. And you can even write us a letter and send it to Mediawatch, PO Box 123, Wellington. Hayden Donnell will be back next Wednesday with Midweek Media Watch. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Media Watch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.